Now we're going to look at these wheels. So let's take a look at these and do the same thing where we open the group. So it'll turn pink. We can still pick the group by picking the corner there, but we can have access to each individual piece of it as well. Let's start out with, well, first we can start out with the lugs here. So those lugs are also groups, but that's okay. We just want to put the generic rust on each one of those. So get the materials, put generic rust on there. Great. Now you notice that these wheels were actually instances, so it's not picking up the material that I just assigned, even though this wheel is an instance of this wheel here. So we might want to you can approach that a couple of different ways. First of all, you can open each group. If you had a lot of instances, though, that would get even 4. It would be kind of a pain to do that. So what I'll just end up doing is delete these other pieces and then re-instance them. You could potentially go in and, as you model it, assign a placeholder material to each piece. That way, when you instanced it and you applied a material, or you edited the placeholder material for each one, then it would update on each one because they already had the material assigned. So you could, if you had some, foresight, you could do that. Unlike me, but I'll just go in and I'm actually going to take each one of these out, and I'm just going to delete them. Then we'll re-instance them once this one is fully has materials applied to it. Okay, so what we'll do is now concentrate on the rim portion of it. And I already made a material for that and imported it from that material library. And you can sort of see that the UVs are real screwed up on this thing. So if we zoom in a little bit and take a look, you see, well, it's kind of okay for one piece of the pie. Remember, we modeled this in sections, but the other sections didn't fare so well. So we need to do something about that. And so if we look at our modifier list here, we get a whole rundown of what we've done to it. Now, if you put a UV map modifier on here, it will apply that UV map modifier only to whatever sub-selection you have. So what I tend to do is put another edit poly modifier over the top of it, one that's set to be the root level as opposed to some sub-selection of it. And that's just me. You don't have to do it necessarily if you know, like for example, there was no sub-selection here, but at the same time, it doesn't really hurt. So what I do, put an edit poly modifier on it, make sure there's no active sub-selection, and then go down and do a UVW map on it. And you see by doing that, then what we've got is, by default, it's projecting along the z-axis, local z. So if we say, well, right now our axis is set to local. So if we go to, or excuse me, it's set to view. So if we go to local, now we'll see, yep, indeed, that's z. So if we want to get a sense of what axis would be better to align to, we can hit X, and then it'll align to X, and then we can hit fit. All right, so that fits that map to the extent of whatever we've got selected. So that seems to work out pretty good. You'll notice, though, that since it's taking that and projecting planarly along like this view, well, it looks good, and it looks good from here, and the map flows. That's the bitmap, and it is projected straight across into this thing. But since this thing has some slight concavities and some sort of ins and outs there, along those parts where you're only getting a small portion of the map, it gets stretched. So that can be a thing that you'll have to watch out for. Now, you'd have to edit the UVs of this thing manually in order to get around that, and you would do that by going to this unwrap UVW modifier. And what that does is, if you put that unwrap UVW modifier on there and hit edit, you get this edit UVs window. And now this would look familiar to you if you've ever done UVs in another application. This is how most apps deal with UVs. Okay, you have to edit sort of the UV map. This is the unwrapped in 2D version of what I've just done. All right, and it allows you to edit individual edges, UVs. You can pick by vertex, edge, or face along there, and you can edit the specific UVs. You can expand their texture coordinates by hitting the scale button here, and then you scale them up. That gives a certain number of faces more UV space. This is something that we're not going to get into in here in this intro. We can cover that in a later sort of more advanced UV editing topic. For now, just know that you sometimes will need to edit UVs in this way, and this is why people, including me, dislike UVs so much, is because this part of it is so unrewarding, but yet you have to have them in order to draw textures properly. And even in the case of simple objects, sometimes they won't get drawn properly. This is probably okay. Are we going to notice it? Maybe not that much. If we got really in close to it, yeah, we would have to edit the UVs for this thing. So, but again, let's save that for a later discussion. We'll worry about simple UV mapping right now, so we don't need to get into it too much. So I'll get rid of that UV unwrap modifier. Okay, so that's working pretty good. So I'm going to take this tire and let's get a new material for it. So we'll do this. We'll call it tire. Okay, now we have we're going to map it with a bitmap. I'm going to just pick this bitmap, and I made I've got a tire here. It has a wheel on it, but that's okay. We're just going to use the tire portion of it. Show that in the viewport here and assign to the tire. I'll make sure I pick the tire and assign it. And you see, well, that's not drawing on there right at all. So what we need to do is we need to adjust the UVs of this thing. Right. So what we'll do is grab this modifier list. We're going to do UVW map, of course. It'll come up with our planar mapping like we had before. Now we can go in and we can go ahead and do align it to one of the edges, one of the axes of it. Or we can do this normal align thing, of course, but it doesn't really work for a tire, but you can see what normal align is doing. It's just aligning itself to whatever direction the face of that current face is pointing out. So normal align, or we can, come in a little bit more like this and do a view align, which will align it, and then a fit, which will, it's roughly it. It'll align it to our camera view, but it's going to be a little bit wonky over here, so maybe that's not the best way to align it. So what we'll do is if we come down here to an ortho view in the right, and then we hit view align again and fit, and then we look in our perspective view again. Now it's going to be perfectly straight up and down. Okay, so you can also reset it if you get real squirrely with it, like if you do a normal align and it gets all goofy. You can hit reset and then it'll default to where it was, and then you can go along, like in this case it looks like it's the X axis, and then hit fit again. So there's numerous options in here for dealing with this. Now, so that's fine. That works out great. And then we can go in and adjust our the tire. We can adjust the material parameters of it. Probably going to need to increase the spec level of it and maybe take the glossiness down a little bit. And we'll rotate this around and see what that looks like. That looks rubbery. So that's good. What we'll do then is we want to put a tread on this, because that's what it's doing. Since it's using a UV map that is planar along this axis, it's just projecting straight through and stretching all this business out, and that's not really working very well. So what we need to do is we need to assign a separate material to just those faces that correspond to the tread rather than the edge. And you can do that in 3D Studio by going to the modifier list and hitting an edit mesh. There's a couple of different ways to do it. You can do edit mesh, or you can do mesh select. I'm going to use edit mesh because it's kind of the simplest way to do it. So I'm going to say edit mesh, and that'll allow me to pick faces. And so I'll go and pick those faces. I'll pick them in this front view here, and let's say I just want to pick, what is it, these ones. That looks pretty good. So just pick those faces. That'll correspond to the tire tread. And what I'm going to do is come down here, and I'm going to assign this to a material ID of 2. So what that means is this one I'm going to assign what's called a multi-material. And a multi-material is just that. It is one material with multiples, and it uses this thing called a material ID to distinguish between them. Okay, so this will be clear when I open the material editor. And what I'll do is I have my tire material, and I'm going to click on this standard button. This is going to allow me to switch types. So I hit standard, and then I'm going to switch it to a sub-object type, hit OK. It'll ask me this question: discard the old material or keep the old material? Well, I want to keep the old material. And so right now I have 10 slots. I have 10 things that this material could be. Okay, so the first one is a tire. And you see there's multiple names here, and then this name is internal to the multi-material. They don't have to be the same, but if you want to call it, if I call it something, I very often call it the same. But you could be like metal, and then you could call it a specific piece of metal, like a screw, or then this one might be a bolt or something else. And even though they have the same actual material, so there's multiple ways to use this, but I often just call them the same things. Again, if I use this at all. But at any rate, now I can have 10 materials. I don't really need 10. I only need 2, really. So I'm going to set number, and I'm going to set this number down to 2. So now I just have 2 materials that I could possibly have on this object. And what it's done is it's taken this, and what I need to do is if you pick on any individual face, it will read out right here what its material ID is. Okay, so right now I have material ID of 2 on the tread and actually 3 on the rest of the stuff. Now that's going to work out okay if I go into the material and I say tire. The reason it stopped drawing is because whenever you change material types, it turns off these the show button. So if I turn it back on, you see, oh, it still is the tire, even though its material ID for all those faces is 3. I don't have 3 submaterials of this thing. What 3D Studio does is if it has a material ID that's more than materials in a submaterial, it just wraps around. So it goes 1, 2, and then 3, and wraps back around to this one. Well, and it works. It would render fine. It would work fine. But if I add another material to this, all of a sudden I'm going to be getting something screwball. Now something that's that isn't what I want. So again, it's probably better to show good form and then set these material IDs to 1. So I can do that by using this select ID, and it'll select all faces on that object that have material ID 3, and then I can set their material ID back down to 1. So now it's correct. So now if I look at this, I have nothing that's green. It's all either the tire or the tread. And then this one doesn't have anything to do with anything. So I can just hit delete. I can either set number back down to 2, or I can hit this, pick that material and hit delete. And that way I have material ID and whatever they are. And so now this new material in here, I'm going to pick it. Actually, what I might want to do is copy this material. So say copy. And that way it's a tire again, but it's a copy of it. So what I'll do is I'll take the bitmap off of it, but what that's done is it's given me the same specular level and glossiness settings, so they'll match across material IDs. And now, but I want to edit this color, so we'll zoom in this a little bit and then pick a color that more closely matches. The gray is not doing it, so that matches whatever that should be. So something like that. Fine, that's good. Something like that. And now I have one material here, another material here. So what I'll do is I can assign a new color map to that, but what I really want to do is assign a bump map to it, a bump map that looks like tread. So I can take this bump map and I'll pick a bitmap, and then I have a tire tread down here. So I pick that, and I can elect to show this map in the viewport. Now, it's not going to show as bump, it's going to show as color, but that's useful for me visualizing it anyway. So what I'll do is I'll pick that, and you can see it's drawing on real screwy, even if I change the tilings or whatever, because it's using those same UVs that it had before, those UVs that are stretched all the way through this region of the object, and that's not correct. So what we need to do is we need to re-UV map that section of that object. So I'm going to take my edit mesh here, and I'm going to select by ID. So I'm going to pick ID 2. I'm going to select all the faces that have ID 2. Now all those faces are picked. And I'm going to apply a UVW map modifier to it. And it'll apply that UV map modifier only to those faces. Now I have a planar picked, and that's not quite right. It looks maybe a little bit better here, but it's stretching here. So what I want to do is that's most like a cylinder. So I'm going to change that to be a cylindrical type. And that cylindrical type, I can either rotate it around. If I open this up and pick the gizmo, I can use any of these transform tools to move it around, including rotate. So I can do it like that. I can transform it freely. Or I come down here, hit reset, and then just pick the right axis. So again, it looks like, if we do here, it looks like X. So align to X. Well, that's not quite right because we're in view mode. You see the X doesn't, that's not local X, that's view coordinate system X. We want the object's local coordinate system, so it's actually Y. So we're going to pick Y, and then it's cylindrically mapped around Y in that way, and then we just hit fit. And that way, it's going to map the tread to the tread image to that region that we want to be the tread in a cylindrical fashion. So come up here and go back to our materials, and then we can set the tiling in UNV, and let's say we do like 10 repeats. That seems pretty good. Maybe not quite 10, maybe 8. And it's going to repeat 8 times around here. And so that bump mapping, now it's drawing on like that. It's not going to render like that because it's just a bump map after all. So if I do hit render on this, you can see I've got bumps. And let's increase the amount of bump and just see. You can go up to whatever number you want in bump. We'll just hit render and see. Yeah, that probably is about right. So we'll just leave it at that. But if I wanted to, I could come in here, go into this, and under the output, hit invert. And when I do that, it's going to invert how the bumps show up. So now that tread is going in. But again, it's not. It's going the correct way at this point. So move it like that, and there we go. Now we have that tire.